المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. So we've been talking about this, we call it al-ubal, the disease or the sickness which is really, really difficult to uproot. There's many such sicknesses, but the sickness of the love of the world is probably the most difficult of all to uproot and deal with. So here, we're going to look what the ulama have said in terms of how we can actually control this. We are, as we mentioned, every human tendency, we say in Arabic, ghariza, every human tendency, there's a purpose for that. As we talked about the purpose of sexual desire, appetite for food, and the survival, and all of these instincts. All of these instincts are there for a purpose. So even the attraction to necessities of the life is part of the human instinct. It's part of the overall scenario and part of our engineering. But if it gets out of hand, then it creates havoc, as we've talked about in detail previously. So how do we control this and direct it in a positive way and save ourselves from the negativity thereof? So number one, the ulama say, al-iqtisad fil ma'isha. And I think if we get this one right, it will facilitate all the other ones very easily. So basically what it means, iqtisad fil ma'isha, moderation in our livelihood, in our lifestyle. We don't need to have, new designer clothing every time the fashion changes, right? It's an interesting story that goes back to the early 1970s. And I happened to be walking around in the streets in probably Buffalo, New York. So a young man, now keep in mind in the 1970s, people were not really accustomed to Muslims and Islam, and it wasn't in the news, and the propaganda wasn't floating around out there as it was. So dressed like this, it wasn't something that you would see all the time. So some young fellow, he came up to me and said, "What kind of clothes are those?" So I said, "Well, what kind of clothes are those?" So, what do you mean? Everybody wears these kind of clothes. So I said, "Well, I know that, but can you tell me why? I'm assuming that you're not a fashion designer yourself, so I don't think you designed that fashion that you're wearing. You're following somebody else's fashion, right?" He said, "Yeah." So what would that be? So obviously the trendsetters in fashion would be movie stars, singers, musicians, sports people, right? Probably I think it would be a consensus they're not the most ethical and moral examples of humanity that we can find, right? Anyway, so I said, these are the people setting the style that you're following, right? He said, yeah, pretty much so. I said, also an interesting thing, think about this. Every 6 months your fashion changes also. Once we had these bell-bottom pants, okay? Then 6 months later, stovepipe. And then, I don't know what else, a hybrid maybe. But the idea is, because it's a consumer world, it's a consumer market. And so the whole economics is running off consumerism. So the human being is not human anymore. He's a giant machine of consumption. And that's what we've been turned into, consumers. So how many consumers? We have human beings, So I said, so what's happening is that you're working hard all, month long, 2, 3, 4, 5 months, and they change the fashion. All this hard-earned cash, but you can't be caught dead wearing the old fashion. I mean, what are people going to say about you, right? So you have to throw out all of those old clothes and buy the new clothes to be up with the fashion, keeping up with the Jones, as they say, And so is that kind of how it works? Yeah, that's pretty much how it works. I said, well, you know what? This fashion is the fashion of the prophets of God, And it doesn't change. It's been going on since, as long as it's, there's thread and it's not threadbare, as long as it's wearable, we can go on with it. So don't misunderstand that I'm advocating everybody has to wear clothes like this. The point is you don't have to change your clothes to keep up with the Joneses, to change the fashion every 6 months, The clothes that you have, wear them until they don't, you can't wear them any longer. So iqtisad bil maisha is moderation in our life, in our lifestyle. So in our clothing, in our residence, in our furniture, we don't need to put all this furniture, into the house. We don't need to redecorate everything. As we mentioned, the masjid now, it's in style, it's in vogue that masjids should be these ornate museum places, actually. And of course, that's very beautiful and it's very appeasing to the eye, and there might be an argument for that. However, if we look at the masjid of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it was a masjid that had a dirt floor. The posts, the structure, the pillars, were the trunks of the date trees, and the branches were the roof. And if there was a heavy rain, it would come into the masjid. If it was a light rain, it might hold it back, but a heavy rain would come into the masjid. And very interestingly, as Ramadan is coming now, Laylatul Qadr is a huge issue. And the Sahaba were very keen to know when would Laylatul Qadr be. So Nabi Sallallahu mentioned in one of the many hadiths, we'll talk about that later in Ramadan, was that on the Laylatul Qadr, I see myself, he saw in a dream, I see that I will be prostrating in water and mud. Very interesting. So it so happened that on the 27th night, or whatever night it was, I remember, maybe it was the 21st night, I think it was. Whatever it was. So that morning, in fact, the Prophet ﷺ prostrated in water and mud. And the Sahaba say that we saw the mud on the forehead and on the nose of the Prophet ﷺ. Okay? Now the very interesting point here, case in point, so you would think that this is terrible. The Prophet ﷺ is, the best of Allah's creation is prostrating in dirt, in mud. Come on, let's fix this up, fix the roof, Nobody even, this thought didn't come to mind because they weren't focused on the external. They were focused on what was the purpose of the masjid, which was to develop an environment, a place of amal, a place of activity. And that's what they were doing. So they weren't worried about, the trimmings and trappings. So if we also would, to some extent, and we don't have to, take radical steps, by the way. Nabi Alayhi Sallam says that the best action which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves the most is the one which the person is consistent in. So if we were spending on new fashions, $10,000 a year, okay, bring it down to 8. Maybe we can bring it down to 5. Slowly. And by the way, we're going to have to bring our families on board to this. And that's not going to happen by do this and don't do that. It's going to be by sharing these concepts, with our family members. So what you're hearing here, share this with your wives, with your children, etc. So if we will learn to live in moderate, in a moderate way, and of course every time and every place, people who are living in Southern California and Irvine, it's a pretty high standard. So if we come down a little bit, that's going to be quite significant. I remember there was a time when a fellow came from South Africa, and he had 3 or 4 servants with him. And he came in the Tablighi Jamaat, where you're supposed to learn how to live a rough life, and he had all these servants with him, Somebody said, hey, what's the deal? You're supposed to be... He said, just keep quiet. In his home, he's got 15 of these guys. He sacrificed 12 of them, and he's only got 3 with him. For him, that's a big deal, So it's all relative, So somebody's apparently small sort of coming down, lowering the level, might be a greater thing in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than somebody who apparently does a very, manifestly great thing. So just the basic concept that however we're eating, we're clothing, our houses, our furniture, our expenditures, are going out for entertainment, that's a huge expense. So we try to bring that down. And once we cut down our expenses, then the need for all of these, for the earning and the spending of more, attention towards getting the resources from these things is also going to be moderated. And it's going to free us up mentally and also physically for a life of ubudiyya for which we were created. There's an interesting riwayat, although it's not very strong, but the meaning of it is no doubt, correct. So Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is reported said something to this effect. Ma'ala man iqtasad. that the person is not going to experience poverty who lives in moderation. Imam Ghazali, rahmatullah, he talks about this in a very succinct and beautiful way. You know, he says, people say that haram, you know, is just so prevalent, and halal is very difficult to acquire. You know, we're not finding halal. Well, actually, he says, you know, in our case, you know, if I need a new BMW or Lamborghini every year or 2 years, and I need to, you know, up my house, you know, and my furniture, then of course that's going to be very difficult to find halal sources for that. But if I'm living a life of moderation, it's going to be easy. There's plenty of halal. He says there's plenty of halal, but we go above and beyond our means. So if we remain within our means, then inshallah there'll be plenty of halal, and the question of poverty, inshallah, is not going to be raised. He also mentions a very interesting hadith that 3 major points. Number 1, at-tadbir nisf al-aish. Tadbir, planning. Now we plan our day, we plan our, you know, our marketing strategies. Do we plan our expenditures? You know, by the way, we're going to be asked, you know, where did we earn and where did we spend? So just as we plan how we're earning, we should be planning how we're going to spend. So this hadith points to this, that tadbir nisf al-aish. So planning the things, you know. This will help us to implement the first concept, this iqtisad, this moderation. Okay, thalatha munjiyat, and he mentions that there are 3 things which are going to bring about our salvation, that are going to save us. Khashyatullah ta'ala fi sirri wal alaniya. The fear, and it's not a fear like, you know, somebody's going to slap you. A fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, khashya, is not just that fear of, you know, that gross kind of fear. It's a fear out of haiba, out of awe of the majesty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Someone who has that connection with Allah and concept, perception of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that fear of Allah, whether it's in the open or whether it's in secrecy, when he's in public and when he's in private, outwardly and inwardly. So khashyat Allah ta'ala fi sirri wal alaniya wal qasd fil ghina wal faqr. This is the case in point. Moderation when we find ourselves in wealth or we find ourselves in straitened circumstances. So it's not like when we're wealthy, we're going to spend a lot, and when we're, you know, we don't have, we're going to be stingy, and, you know, sort of, no, we remain moderate regardless of what the, and we also probably mentioned earlier on, the salient characteristic that was, you know, differentiating the rich, quote unquote, rich of the Sahaba and our pious ancestors and the, you know, the conventional rich person is that they didn't consider those riches theirs. They considered that the riches, these are amanat, these are trust in their hands. They will use what is moderately useful for them that they need, and the rest of it, they see it as resources to be spent on the others. And prolifically, we're going to see examples of that from Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam and Sahaba. So khashyatullah fil sirri wal alani, the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in open and in secret. Moderation, regardless of whether we're in, you know, we're in plenty or in poverty, and adl fil rida wal ghadab, and justice and equity, whether we're in a happy mood or whether we're, you know, fired up and we're angry. So justice is to be observed, and in all these cases. So that's all revolving around the concept of iqtisad, moderation and spending. Second thing that we need to learn to control is what we call tul al-amal. One is amal and one is amal. One is ayn, one is hamza. Amal is this long aspirations, this, you know, 50, 100-year planning, I'm going to have this and all that. Not to say that this is not to be done in certain circumstances, but we have this aspirations that go on and on and on and on and on, you know. Whereas Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam drew a diagram, and he basically drew a diagram with a box. And then he drew a line that went way out of the box. And then he drew lines that sort of went, you know, right and left. He said, this is the lifespan of the human being, hada ajaluhu. And it ends here. And here is his amal. It goes on and on and on like he's going to live forever, you know. Whereas we should be living like we're going to die tomorrow, if not today. And then he says, these, lines, these are the difficulties, the trials and tribulations that are, if this one misses you, this one hits you. If you miss that one gets you. So this is how the life is. It's like the sea. After the storm is the calm. The calm is going to usher in the storm, and so forth and so on. So this tool al-amal. So we should, and that takes us to the next one, which is qina. So if we have these long aspirations, then we're going to try and play them out. And it's going to engage our minds, it's going to engage our bodies, it's going to engage our resources. So we should keep things realistic. It doesn't mean that we don't plan things. We just already heard that planning is half of, our ma'isha or aish. So we plan, but with the constant awareness of the fact that we plan as a good intention. If I live, I'll do this, inshallah, and things which are connected and they're linked to our objective. And if I die tomorrow, I'm prepared for that. One of our pious, I can't really say colleague, but one of our pious teachers, very senior teacher in Binuri town, the day that he died, he was reading the dars, and he came to the ayat, "Innal abrara lafi na'im wa innal fujjara lafi jahim." The pious people are in paradise, and the bad people